and welcome to the Gray Area, where I give interviews with developers, talk about gaming news and reviews, and focus on the interrelationships between gamers. My name is Genesee Gray, and this is the 94th episode in a weekly series called Akanero Acclaim. Here with me is American McGee, developer and founder of Spicy Horse. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you very much for having me on today.
You're welcome. We're going to try this chat room and recording, and hopefully the bandwidth will hold. If it shouldn't, we'll just do what we can.
Yeah.
Last week's episode was a discussion with Dino Ignacio, lead user interface designer for electronic arts through Visceral Games. Please visit www.genesee.com to add to the forum discussion on that topic and to tell me your story. Today is Wednesday, February 6th, and we're going to talk about Spicy Horse, Alice Madness Returns, and Akanero Demon Hunters. So, let's start with our first question. What is your news of the week? What's going on for you?
Well, this has been a pretty exciting week for us because we just came back from Chinese New Year, which is a 10-plus day event where something like 300 million people in China travel back to their hometowns. So it's the largest human migration on the planet that happens yearly, and of course it's a big vacation for us. So we all did that. Of course, I stayed in Shanghai, didn't travel back with a million people.
Sure, that'd be fun.
Now we're back in the office, and so we're starting to put together the roadmap for what we're going to be doing with Akanero going forward. A lot of this is in response to our recent successful Kickstarter campaign, and of course for the other projects that we're running live, like Big Head Bash and Crazy Fairies, there's also a lot going on to kind of come back to the office and get them fixed up after the holiday.
Excellent. So what is that like, seeing all the people moving around? Does everyone that's not matriculating back to their house kind of stay because of all the traveling populace running around there? Or what is that like in a city with everyone moving so much?
It's really crazy. So Shanghai is a pretty crazy city to begin with. There's 25 million people living here, so it's one of the most crowded and busiest cities on the planet. And then you get Chinese New Year that comes along, and suddenly something like 5 million or 6 million people leave. Plus, everybody's spending time with their families, so it goes from being this really incredibly busy place to overnight becoming like Zombieville, where there's no one on the streets. It's extremely quiet. So it's a really nice time, actually. I actually kind of like to stay in the city during the holiday because it's one of the few times that you can walk outside on the street and not get run over by a car or pushed around on the sidewalk. So yeah, it's actually a pretty interesting thing to witness. But if you were trying to travel, it's a terrible thing. You hear stories of people having to wear diapers while standing in line for the trains and the buses because the lines will go on for days as they're trying to get to their hometown, which may be thousands of miles away from a big city like Shanghai.
Okay, so most people work in the city and then they leave to go to kind of outer towns?
Yeah, it's migrant workers, and I think even when you look around our studio, you'll find that China's a big place. So it's just like if you had a hub of culture and creativity in Los Angeles, but in fact, most people who live in LA are not from Los Angeles. They're from all over the United States. Shanghai is very much the same way. The difference is that, sort of where in LA, everybody goes back home for Christmas or Thanksgiving. Here, it's Chinese New Year, and suddenly you've got 200 or 300 million people trying to travel all at the same time.
Wow. Okay, interesting. Let's start with some of the gaming questions I have for you in your childhood. Were you a gaming child, and what were your favorite games when you were young?
Well, when I was growing up, the kind of gaming machines we had access to were pretty primitive. There were things like the Odyssey system, which your users would have to be pretty old to know what that was. But I mean, we started off on Atari, and we started off on these things that were like calculators you plugged into your television. But I grew up in a kind of resource-limited environment, meaning we didn't have a lot of money. So most toys that I had were ones that I built for myself. So my family thought that a good kind of Christmas or birthday present for me oftentimes would be like a coffee can filled with string and batteries and motors and lights. And so their idea was that I would go and build my own toys. And so that, I think, is one of the reasons why, to this day, I really enjoy, kind of making games or any kind of tinkering or creative endeavors, is because I grew up with that kind of play as opposed to being given finished toys that didn't require as much imagination.
So what led you toward the more development side rather than engineering? I would think, actual building with your hands.
Yeah, I started off programming, and so when I got my first entry into the industry, which was at id Software, one of the things that I was doing in addition to level design was programming. I've kind of run the gamut from sound and music to level design to programming to game design to production, you name it. But to this day, I still get very mechanically involved in my hobbies. So on the side, when I'm not making games, I like building electric scooters. Scooters are a very big way of getting around Shanghai. So there's like
Okay.
12 or 15 million electric bicycles or scooters here. And so
I'm
I
thinking of it
like,
like razor scooters. Is that what you mean? Like it's a
no,
hand.
no. It looks just like a normal kind of gasoline scooter, like a Vespa
Ah,
or
okay, okay.
something like that. But it's driven by batteries and an electric motor. And so one of my hobbies on the side is to build those, but to build them very fast. I mean that they go fast, not that I build them fast.
Interesting. So you have like racing scooters.
I don't really race them, but
You race to work.
drive them back and forth to work and stuff of like a Mad Max race. Yeah.
Neat. So were your parents supportive of, games in general? And they seem to be supportive of you building things. When you started to play, did they like that as well?
I'd say that they were kind of hands off in terms
Okay.
of parenting. Again, I would describe my childhood as sort of resource limited, and I think that also applied to the time and attention that I was getting from the sort of parental figures in my life. So I was left to my own devices most of the time.
Okay. Something I was wondering about, and I wanted to ask you too, I guess kind of the purpose for that question is a lot of people that I speak to kind of play games as a child or they get into video games, very young. And it seems like in the news lately, the reputation of video games has been somewhat questionable with all of them kind of being lumped together in the land of violent video games. And I wonder for, younger adults and children if they're going to end up being discouraged from going into something like video games because of that, and if it's going to end up being like the rebellious teens way to buck the system is to become a developer. I guess what are your thoughts on something like that?
I think already that, well, since I started, which is 20 years of making games, I mean, when you talk to kids, as far as I understand, being a game developer is now up there with like race car driver or astronaut in terms of top of the list of things they'd like to do when they grow up. I don't think that the conversations we have about violence in media or the impact that our media has on us psychologically is going to necessarily affect whether or not kids change their aspirations, right? I mean, we know that rock stars have always come with a sort of warning label in the music industry in general, but that doesn't seem to discourage kids. If anything, it seems to drive them towards the mystique and the allure of it. And so, yeah, I don't think that these conversations are going to discourage kids from wanting to get into the industry.
That's good. So how do you go from your more hands-on toy building kind of childhood to getting into school and deciding that you'd like to go and into the music production, sound effect development, let's see, programming, level design? You had a whole set of diverse skills that you picked up. How did you decide to go that direction? What got you interested in that?
Well, again, this all kind of went back to my childhood. I mean, I was a tinkerer and a person who played with a lot of different, whether it was machines or software or whatever. My schooling actually ended quite early. I came home one day to find that my house was empty. And so when I was still in high school, I was forced to drop out and go out on my own. And I spent some years working as a car mechanic before I found my way into the games industry. So I don't think that in those days there wasn't a lot of like a sort of plan to go and become a game developer.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when I was a kid, I was more interested in becoming a marine biologist or some type of hands-on scientist in the world. I was a big fan of Carl Sagan and Jacques Cousteau. So gaming and computers never really entered into it from an entertainment perspective. I always looked at it more like a tools and hard science sort of perspective. And it wasn't until someone randomly opened the door and said, "Would you like to stop being a car mechanic and come and become a game industry person?" that the idea kind of took form. And of course, I said yes and jumped on the opportunity.
Tell me more about that. That's like everyone's dream. How did you end up working for id?
Yeah, that was just right place at the right time. I had moved to a new apartment complex, and in that same complex, there was a guy who would come home driving a Ferrari, and I would come home covered in grease, driving the shop truck, oftentimes with like a dead motor in the back of it. And we became friends and started playing Nintendo and games together. And after, I don't know if it was a year or so, he started to invite me to go to ID to help them test on their games. And so that started off, I think they were still coming out of the Wolfenstein era. And by the time they were working on Doom, he had invited me to come and work in the studio full time.
Excellent. Working on games like Doom 2 and Quake 2, I mean, that's huge in the industry for your first games to be working on. What did you end up doing for those, and what was it like kind of jumping into that?
It was very much like getting a free pass into Disneyland. Having someone open the gates and say, "Hey, you're welcome to come in here and play." When the customers aren't around, you get to be behind the scenes and help us build the puppets. And so I really felt like a kid set free inside of an amusement park. And the opportunity was tremendous in that there was a lot of freedom. There were only 8 people at ID, including the receptionist, when I was
Wow.
hired. So I was the 9th employee. And I was kind of told that, you can do whatever you can prove that you're good at, which for me meant that I just didn't go home. I stayed and worked and learned and really pushed myself to be as useful in as many places as I could make myself useful. And I learned a tremendous amount. It was like boot camp for games. And it was also a really interesting time for me in terms of personal development, just growing up and learning about working inside of a company with other, kind of competitive, creative individuals, learning about office politics, learning very young about the dangers of making too much money too fast. So there was a lot that I learned and that I took away from the experience. And I would say that, it was absolutely fantastic.
While you were there, did you have any idea of the magnitude of the games you were working on?
Yeah, I think we all kind of figured that out very early on because we would get the connection that we had with the customers was really phenomenal. And it would be something like a professor at one of the larger universities, say in Wisconsin or something, who would write and say, please don't release your game demos the week before finals because you're screwing up the grade average. And so, or we'd get an email from somebody at a data center somewhere who would say, please don't release your demos or your games, during this time period because you're screwing up our bandwidth and our ability to serve our customers because the data centers can't handle this.
Wow.
So there were all kinds of impacts in the real world that we were hearing about that really affected people's lives. And I think that started happening very early on, that we understood that these games would go out and change the world. And, it's not like they were necessarily changing it for the better, but you could certainly see plenty of evidence of there being an impact.
That would be interesting, I think, doing something that you knew was going to have such an impact. Not that you wouldn't be concentrating and paying a lot of attention and putting your all into it, but I think that would definitely be inspiration.
Yeah. Well, I think everything that we do, I mean, this is the problem that we have in this day and age, is that we ignore the externalities. We don't think about how every single thing that we purchase, that we put our hands on, every action that we make, whether it's making a game or it's purchasing an iPhone, or it has a ripple effect throughout the world around us. And that is now being compounded by the number of people that are on the planet and how connected we are. And this goes back to your question about, the impact of violence or media in general on people's brains. We're forcing evolution on ourselves and on our psychology and on our physiology these days at a rate that's unprecedented in the history of man. And I think it's still going to be another 50 years before it really starts to catch up with us and we understand just what we've done to ourselves over the last 50 years.
I agree. Isaac Asimov, interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so after this, I believe you became the creative director for EA. Can you